I invite you to open up your Bibles back up to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 that we read just a moment ago, and we'll pick up there this evening. We began this morning talking about the subject of love, and we looked at the difficulty in defining the word love, and then talked just a little bit about one expression of love, that being affection, a very feeling-based aspect of love. And I mentioned this morning that what I'd like to do this evening is talk about three other aspects and then sort of draw those together and hopefully make some connections to God himself, who is love, as we read about this morning. So in looking at some other ways that love manifests itself, I want to begin this evening by looking at the idea of friendship. And as we look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6, I do believe there's a key element of that kind of relationship, that sort of companionship that really defines friendship. And that is that friendships are based on, or the foundations of friendships are in common interests. And this is the thing that Paul really points to as he's writing to the Corinthians. Several writers have observed that if we're talking about affection, then that is a relationship where the attention is pointed at the person, right? We talk about the object of our affection, right? So this is the person that I have affection towards, and the same thing would be true with romantic love that we're talking about, right? That's a person that our love is directed towards. But in friendship, very often, the source of the friendship is not in the first instance each other, but rather that we're both pointed in the same direction. It's a side-by-side relationship as opposed to a face-to-face relationship. Now, understand that what I'm saying is not that there is no affection in friendship, but rather that results from the commonality. In other words, we come alongside each other, and it's sort of like, you know, if we're just thinking about it in descriptive terms, it's like you notice somebody else is noticing the same thing you are. Oh, hey, look, you're interested too in this thing. And maybe there's that sense of, I didn't know other people were interested in this. And so you form a bond, and especially as that interest is more unique, that it would cause you to form a closer and tighter knit bond. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, as Steve just read for us there, notice the argument there beginning in verse 14, that he says, what partnership, or do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership? That is the idea of that sort of relationship. Have righteousness and lawlessness. What fellowship has light with darkness? And he goes on to give this list, and he basically says, how can you carry on relationships when your interests are so very, or at least your fundamental foundational interests are so very divided? Now I want to suggest to you that in friendships, the more interests that we do share, the more we find we have in common, the closer we are liable to grow as friends. It's not the only thing that might cause us to grow in friendship, but it certainly is a major aspect of that. Sometimes people have a concept of friendship as if it transcends interests, but that's really not true. In fact, it is the uncommonality of interests, or the diverging of interest, that very often is the thing that ruins friendships. That's where breaks begin to happen. That seems to be a conversation in the country right now, is people talking about friendships and family relationships breaking down because interests are diverging. And people are talking about whether that's appropriate or not. And I think in some places it's very inappropriate. I think in some places it is appropriate. Right? How fundamental are these divisions? Maybe sometimes we think that if we're together, if we're in proximity, that would cause the development of friendship. But that's not necessarily the case. It can be. In my first trip to Fiji several years ago, I went with Marshall McDaniel, and we had a relationship, and it's one of the reasons we chose to go together there to Fiji. But in being there and in sharing a single bedroom, you're in very close proximity, And you have lots of time to have conversation about all sorts of things. And one of the things that we discovered is the more we talked, the more we found we agreed on. The more we found we were of the same mind about so many different things. And by the end of that trip, our relationship was much closer than when it had began. But some of you will know that just because you have a roommate, it does not automatically result in friendship. In fact, I've had quite the opposite to occur. You end up living in very close proximity to a person, and because you're in such close proximity, that old adage, familiarity breeds contempt instead of closeness. You learn all sorts of things about this person. You could be friends at a distance, but the proximity actually made it harder to be friends. Oh, I never would have thought that that this would have been your character, that this would have been your type of behavior. And so we need to appreciate that aspect. Now, it is not fair to sort of boil down friendship to a certain calculus. If you have these number of things in common, then you can be friends. And, like you take a quiz, and if you score below this number, you can't be friends. Score above this number, you can be friends. It's more of a weighted common interest, right? So, and this goes to what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians, there are certain things that if you have these things in common, other things should not matter. Conversely, if you do not have these things in common, other things should not matter. Right? So you could have lots of shallow common interests where you can have sort of a surface relationship, so long as the only thing we're talking about is the football team we both pull for, or the hobby that we both have an interest in, or the work that we both are engaged in. We're fine and we can have a relationship. But the moment it turns to deeper things, maybe the friendship begins to break down. Right? And so those surface interests will not hold us together if our foundational interests are in opposite directions. On the flip side, if those foundational interests are common, then it doesn't matter if we have very different walks of life. We have very different interests and hobbies. Those things are meaningless by comparison. So we want to appreciate that. And sometimes what Christians need to do is evaluate, like these Christians in Corinth needed to evaluate, how is it if my closest friends are people I do not have this commonality with, well then what does that mean about my foundational interests? Right? If I find myself being able to form tighter and closer relationships with people outside of the kingdom, then what does that mean? And it may mean that I don't have those foundational interests that overlap with my brethren. And that's exactly what Paul is describing here. That somehow you're able to maintain affections, you're able to maintain relationship, companionship, fellowship with idolaters, but not Paul. How could that be? Except that the things that Paul says are not as important to them as the other commonalities that they share with people of the world. One of the aspects of forming relationships is that those loyalties, those common interests and allegiances, and we talked about faith and faith being an allegiance. When we have common allegiances, then it leads to loyalties on the horizontal plane, right? So we're both sworn in our allegiances in the same direction, and that gives us an automatic camaraderie and a willingness to sacrifice for one another. This is the alliance of soldiers, right? And so when you have two soldiers who are very committed to the same purpose, they are automatically brought together in a way that is very self-sacrificial. I would do anything for this fellow soldier of mine. We are fighting the same battle. We're pointed in the same direction. Proverbs chapter 18 has much to say of the resulting behavior of friendship. Now, I don't think what Proverbs says here is what causes friendship, but rather what results from friendship. So Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 24, it says, a man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Now, your translation may say something very different in verse 24. And Matt Davis can tell you about that difference. I remember that from when he was teaching Proverbs. So depending on what translation you're using, the first may indicate that many friends are a good thing, or in the New American Standard, that they will bring you to ruin. But that does not affect the second half of the verse, which says a real friend will stick there when nobody else will. But why will he do that? Is it that a true friend will stick with you no matter who you are and no matter what your character is, no matter what your interests are? Or is it that this man will stick next to you because of those common interests? Because you have been drawn so tightly together in common allegiance. Now, I believe the second is the truth there. I believe the other would go back to what we talked about this morning, that sort of unexplained affection, like a parent would stick by a child inexplicably, except that they're my child. But that's not necessarily the same. That's not how friendships form. To that point, I think that one of the things that we need to appreciate is that some people have a hard time forming friendships because their greatest interests lie right here. And if your greatest interest is you, nobody will be as interested in that as you. And so there's people who want the relationships, but they don't understand the sort of common interests on which those relationships are built. Or they want relationships that transcend interests. Well, those are the building blocks of relationships. To be able to speak with someone and have the notion of we understand things the same way. And the more you have those conversations, the closer you feel drawn together. And the more you have those conversations and you begin to think, we are in very different places. It feels like we live in two different worlds. It's not to mean that you can't love that person, but that's not the foundation for friendship. Understand, that's a very different thing. And so these ideas of loyalty are loyalty built on that very premise. We're fighting the same battle. And when we go to fighting different battles, why then that changes the dynamic of our relationship. We may even be enemies. Again, I can love my enemy, but I'm not necessarily going to be friends with my enemy. And so friendship it must be on that basis. So as I hear these conversations happening in the world, and people are saying, I had to walk away from this friendship because I found out that my friend voted for this person, or I found out that my friend believes in this political view, and people are horrified by that. Or at least some people are horrified by it. Others feel pretty justified by that. And so where do we stand on that? Well, I think it depends. I think there are issues that may begin in the political world, but maybe they expose very foundational and fundamental differences in how we see reality. And it may be the thing. Now, I think what's happening in the world very often is hatred ensues. There's no call for that. But if we say, listen, our closeness is being ruined by this, yes, that may well be the case. Because as we pursue very different perspectives, we are diverging in those interests upon which that commonality was built and that friendship and loyalty was built. Again, along those lines, there are some things that the Proverbs says about what friends do and the value of friends that don't define the basis for friendship, but rather speak to when you form that commonality, the value of what happens in the midst of that relationship. So Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 6. Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 6, it says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. There's two ways to look at that. You could look at that and say, how do you know if somebody's your friend? Well, you know that they're your friend if they will tell you off. That's proof. Well, that's not, I think, really what the Proverbs are saying here. I think what it's saying is when a friend is honest with you, that there's real value in that. That is not the proof of their being a friend, but rather that is the thing that makes their words, them being a friend, is what makes their words so impactful and able to be appreciated. So I think some people do take that approach and say, well, I'm going to go try to be a friend. I'm going to let them have it. Okay, that doesn't build the relationship. It is, I'm going to go be honest with this person because I believe they'll hear me because they know I'm their friend, right? And so on the basis of a relationship that is already established, this is possible. And it is better, of course, than the deceitful kisses of the enemy. But we don't want to get those confused. We don't want to get those backwards. There's the foundation of a friendship. Then there are the values and results of a friendship. And Proverbs generally communicates to us the latter of those two. As we consider friendship and what's possible there, and those common interests drawing us together, we find that it is among the greatest of loves that is communicated. In 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 26, David speaks of his friendship with Jonathan, which also is recorded for us back in 1 Samuel chapter 20 as well as other places, but particularly there in 1 Samuel chapter 20 when things kind of come to a head between David and Saul, and there's Jonathan in the middle. But at the death of Saul and Jonathan, David has this to say, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. When they departed back in 1 Samuel, they departed with kisses and embracing and weeping. We are not so affectionate generally in our friendships as all of that. And so, to a modern reader, to many modern readers, what they see is romance. That they cannot see friendship that is so deep that it would look that way, especially among men. But kisses in affection have long been, in fact, as far as the whole of history, our society stands as peculiar. Throughout most of history, people kiss to show their affection, brotherly affection, friendship affection, as well as romantic affection. And if you don't know the difference between those types of kisses, then talk to your parents. There's a difference. But here, there's a very passionate relationship. And what David is saying is there's a deeper sense of commonality. There's a deeper sense of connection here than any connection I've ever had with a woman. Now, I want to suggest to you that does not mean that should be typical. I think, in fact, that as we look at David's life, we should be able to understand why Jonathan's friendship was better than any woman. Look at the relationships of David and the women in his life. Of course, this would be a closer relationship because it is friendship. Now, the greatest element is when you find in romantic love also a friend. But I don't think David ever found that. And so there is a combination of friendship and romance that can be deeper than friendship itself. But if you are comparing the two and you have only the romantic over here and you have only the friendship over here, let me ask you, what would you choose? What companion would you choose for the rest of your life? The one that you could have the passionate stirs of romance, or the person you could have the deep companion that David describes here? I don't think we have to choose. But I want to show that the way David speaks about that is something that can be found. And it is certainly not as so many would indicate, only found in some sort of homosexual context, which is what a lot of people will try to do with that passage. Along those lines, then, understand that David didn't say this about everybody, and we cannot be equally deep friends with everyone. It's not possible for us to have that level of depth of emotional connection with everyone. It would be exhausting for one thing, but also too time consuming, right? We are very limited. And even Jesus himself, I think, was limited in that capacity while he walked the earth. And so while we see Jesus on the earth, he is not equal in his closeness to everybody he comes in contact with. If anybody could have been, it would have been Jesus. And yet there are varying degrees of closeness. We've talked about this before, as we have the apostles and really disciples, broadening out from the apostles. We have disciples who followed Jesus, and among them not only apostles but women who ministered to him. And so Jesus has this group who seems to go with him everywhere he goes, and they have a relationship with Jesus that the crowds do not have. The apostles have a relationship even inside of that group of disciples. The three, Peter, James, and John, are there when the other apostles are not there. But finally, we see John writing about himself with this moniker, the disciple whom Jesus loved, which, honestly, maybe if John wrote this when I think he wrote this, all the other apostles were dead and wouldn't have gotten offended. But can you imagine being the other? Oh, you're the one he loved. I see. I think Peter might well have thought something like that. But I don't think it's John putting on airs. I think he really is saying we had a relationship that was closer than any other. And that's not boastful. It's just, there's almost a humility that he won't even call his own name. And I think that would be more characteristic of what we see from this apostle. So what do we see? Well, in John chapter 19 and verse 26, we see Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. And he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Kevin made the point the other night in our class. What closeness would have been there, and what potential offense. Jesus has got brothers and sisters alive. And he calls this apostle in such a way that indicates that he's not only close to him, he's closer maybe than even his brothers. And says, "Here, I turn the care of my mother over to you." That's a striking statement of really exaltation of John in the estimation of Jesus. We see that development of that relationship does provide for some potential jealousy. We see those jealousies all throughout represented. There's jockeying for position among the apostles, and even John himself engages in some of that. But notice at the end of John's gospel, in chapter 21, in verse 21, we have that scene where Jesus is just told Peter, indicated to Peter, of the death with which he would die. And so Peter, seeing him, that is, seeing John there, described in sort of roundabout ways there in verse 20, he sees him and he says, "Lord, what about this man?" And Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." And then so therefore, this saying went out among the brethren, that disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you?" And of course, then he identifies himself. It's that disciple who's actually writing this book. And so that's where we make that connection back through the rest of the gospel. So what's happening there? I mean, Jesus is saying to Peter some bad news maybe, right? You're going to die and it's going to be really uncomfortable. And what does he do? But he turns to, I think, the one that he knows has a favored relationship. What about your favorite disciple? What about your favorite apostle? Don't worry about him. Now, Peter gets his own favoritism. And especially as we go through the book of Acts, we see the exaltation of Peter among the apostles and his work getting the focus. But I just make the point that sometimes, if we're not careful, we instead of seeing beauty in friendship among God's people, we immediately assume the worst. So we see close relationships maybe within a group like this. We say, oh, that's a clique. Well, it may be. And that may be something very problematic that needs to be addressed. But then again, it may just be they've got some common interests. Yeah, I remember the first time I heard that Seth had gone hunting with Eric Johns. And I didn't go, Eric didn't ask me to go hunting. Well, no, because I don't hunt. I just want them to bring the meat back. I don't want to go. So I'm not thinking of that. In fact, I'm like, well, that's great. I love that God's people are finding commonalities and are finding ways to draw near to each other in those commonalities and become friends and close. And so instead of seeing it as a bad thing, it's something that ought to bring us joy. Even if we're not the ones finding that particular commonality in that place, that's okay. And if we're finding that we don't fit in any of those groups, maybe one of the things we need to evaluate is, where are my interests? Do I have interests that would allow me to engage with other people? Or do I have the sort of interests that keep me cut off from other people? Am I putting my time and attention to things that would keep me separated? Like, all the things I'm interested, I can't talk about around you people. Well, that's a problem. And that's going to be a cause of distance in our relationships. And so we need to be thoughtful of that. One more thing to note about friendship, and that is over in John chapter 15. John chapter 15. In each of these cases, I want us to see that God describes himself as the Father and therefore speaks of his relationship to us in terms of affection, fatherly affection to a child. God describes his relationship to us in terms of friendship. And so we see here in John chapter 15 and in verse 14, you are my friends. And it's a wonderful thing to hear from Jesus, from God in the flesh saying to mere men, you are my friends. But the terms of that friendship are not the same. We've talked about this recently when we were talking about grace and the nature of our relationship to God. That it is one thing for him to call us friends. It is another thing to claim that for ourselves. And so in verse 14, you are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slave, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. Really, by doing what Jesus says, we are engaging with common interest with Jesus, right? We're doing the will of his Father. That is what interests Jesus most. And when we come into commonality with that, he says, you are my friends. We can be friends because we got the same purposes. We got the same goals. We got the same focus. But as I mentioned before, in just about any other context, if somebody says, you can be my friend if you'll do what I say, we'd be like, that's probably not a friendship I want to pursue. But in the case of Jesus, it is. Because what I want to do is exactly what he tells me. And it is in my best interest to do what he tells me to do. So it works out really well. And so that is the foundations, that is the basis of our friendship. It is not a peer type friendship. It is someone who has my interest, and when I follow him, we're following the same goals, which is to my best interest. Well, then, looking at romantic love. In the idea of romance, again, we talked about this morning as we go down and think of one love being less noble than another. Let me say, first of all, that if we're thinking of romantic love in its noblest sense, I think in its noblest presentation, it is there in Genesis 2 and verse 24. That a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That notion of having a love for someone that is so deep that you would forsake all others. That used to be the common language of marriage vows, forsaking all others. And so you would forsake all others and put this person first before all others in your life. Now, somebody might say, well, now God comes before that. Yes, but we're talking about the human plane, right? On the human plane, there is no one who comes before the person that you have this relationship with. You forsake all others. So there's a real beauty to that. That you sacrifice everything. You set everything down in order to have a relationship with this person. How much would you set down? Even your father and mother, right? Up to that point. It's not like set your father and mother down, everything else you can keep. Rather, it's indicating that your father and mother, if you walk away from them, that means you walk away from everything. And so they come first. And of course, that's a picture. That's a picture, as Paul would say in Ephesians chapter 5, of the love between Christ and the church. Some people look at the romantic love, and what they see is primarily the sexual aspect. So when you look at the word eros and the word erotic that we get from that, they see the sexual as the primary component. But I think that is not so. When it is the primary component, it's a distortion. And it doesn't last. We saw that with Amnon and Tamar. When we think about Amnon, when he got what he wanted from Tamar, he no longer desired her, but rather it says he hated her more intensely. The hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And so, in the end result, Amnon did not really want Tamar, but he wanted something from Tamar. In commenting on this, there was one writer who was noting that there's the type of man who always wants a woman, right? He's always in search of a woman. And he was talking about somebody who's always looking for the pleasure of a woman's company. And then when he finds that and satisfies that, he dismisses her and moves along. C.S. Lewis, in response to that, said what this man wants actually is anything but a woman. That's not actually what he wants, because it comes with companionship that goes on after the sexual relationship and comes before the sexual relationship. Here's a man who only wants pleasure, and he is unconcerned of the identity of the one who gives it. But romantic love has a target in mind, right? It is expressed in this way: she is the one. And when we have that kind of love and desire in somebody, and we cannot gratify it, and somebody says, there's other fish in the sea, I don't want any of those. I wanted this one. That is the nature of it. It is not merely sexual. It has an identity. I want her. Now, that is not to say that it cannot be trained in various directions and that it cannot grow and shrink. But it is to say that it certainly is not only sexual. In fact, as you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and you read through there, and the Apostle Paul is talking about the dangers of marriage in the circumstances that the Corinthians are living in, he doesn't seem to think that the sexual aspect is the real danger if they get married. In fact, he says, if you get married, then absolutely gratify the sexual appetites of one another. Give yourselves over to that. His concern seems to be, as you go down through the passage and read later on, seems to be that more everyday devotion. You're going to be concerned about how you must please your wife, or the wife how she ought to please her husband. And so it is the overarching demands of marriage, not the momentary demands, the occasion demand of the sexual relationship. He says, no, that's fine. What I'm worried about is the constant pull on your attention. And I think that is an aspect of that love, that it is a constant attention. And I think what Paul is saying here is it ought to be, right? You ought to be giving that constant attention to the one that you have professed this kind of love towards. Well, This love, and again in its noblest form, is the kind of love that is utterly yielding. We see that in the sexual aspect there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that even in the sexual act it is you belong to her and she belongs to you. You give yourself over. But of course, Paul speaks more fully of that in Ephesians chapter 5 as he uses the language of Genesis chapter 2. And that language of the two becoming one flesh. The yielding is such that identities begin to overlap. That identities come into a oneness. You are identified with each other by your connection to each other. And so we use that language, where's your better half? And that's good language. I think that's right language. That's right. She is half of me. And when she is not there, I am half of a person. And so that we so identify with that relationship that when it is broken, we are broken. I think that's the picture that we see here in Ephesians chapter 5. Because when he points to Christ's love, what does Christ's love look like? That he would let himself be destroyed for the cause of this relationship. He would give himself, he would sacrifice himself quite literally for this relationship. What about the woman's role? That she would submit and be identified by her submission to him. We as the church take on the name of Christ. He gives himself to us. We give ourselves to him. Different ways, right? There's different aspects of that, but both of it is a yielding to the other. And so many times what we have in romantic relationships is things that unfortunately never get quite that deep, but that only think in terms of, is this enjoyable? Really what we end up having is relationships that the thought process is, I will maintain this so long as it is a viable friendship. And instead of having this kind of self-sacrificial devotion, if our interests start to diverge, it's like friendships will diverge. But see, here's a relationship that maintains even when there is not friendship. And I think that if we really have that love, that we know what that's like. I would have her, even if it means I am not happy, because I would be miserable without her. Now, I am happy. Don't take anything from that. But there are people who would be devoted to miserable relationships because they're devoted to this kind of love. God himself has been devoted to that sort of misery-inducing relationship because he loves us dearly, and he wants the relationship that certainly goes both directions. Well, finally, that brings us to charity. That is the King James translation of what we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And again, it's not agape itself that does this, but it is the description that Paul gives here in 1 Corinthians 13 that gives us that definition. And we see the work that must be done then in really performing, acting out this sort of love. That it is patient, that it is kind and not jealous, does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, it is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And so we have a list here of roles and responsibilities that we can really begin to sink our teeth into. We're not talking about mere feelings or affections at this point, but now we're talking about fruits of the Spirit, right? We're talking about things that can be pursued more directly. As we began talking about affection is hard to pursue directly, And I think 1 Corinthians chapter 13 gives us the indirect path to get to affection. Right? You do this, and affection is the result. Think of it like a garden. When you think of not just the kind of gardens we have, but like manor house gardens, like Biltmore house gardens, right? The manicured nature of those and the work and the effort that goes into providing these beautiful spots. But what they can't do is just go in there and make it grow. They have to go in and they have to fertilize and wait and plant seeds and tend and wait. And they have to pull weeds out and wait. And so much of it is just doing all the things that you can do and wait. Too many times people get into that cycle of bitterness and frustration with one another, and they want to have affection, but it's not there. They don't know how to just create it. And it's like wanting a garden and wanting it today. But what you have to say, it's like a neighbor of mine who had kind of a golf course putting green front yard. I said, what does it take to get that? I want that. And he began explaining it to me. He says, now, you're going to have to do this every day. You're going to have to spend this money. You're going to have to basically make it your part-time job. And then in about 3 years, you'll have this. Well, I don't want it that bad. So never mind. But we're not allowed to do that. When somebody says, how do you get that affection? How do you get to feel about people like that? You say, all right, here's what you're going to have to do. And it's going to be constant. You're going to have to really work at it and think very carefully about it. And it's going to be an everyday practice. And if you'll stick with it, over time, you'll begin to see the way that you feel about people change. Because you've taken on more characteristics of God, and you begin to see them as God sees them. You begin to love them as God loves them, but it won't happen today. You don't get to have a garden today, but you get to begin tending. You can begin digging the foundations of your garden today. I think loving God is the foundation. It is what humbles us for the work that is before us. In Ephesians chapter 4, and in verse 32, it says, be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ has also forgiven you. This love must come from that humble place of recognizing that we do not deserve God's love towards us. That it is our kindness and tenderness towards other people is not a result of our own goodness, but rather is an overflow of what we have received. And in being an overflow of what we have received, it keeps us from getting that haughtiness that says, yes, I am kind and charitable to these lowly people over here who have no friends. I'll be their friend even if nobody else will. That is an insufferable love, and nobody really wants it. This is the kind of love that is genuine, that truly sees something there that God sees, that God wants us to see, and cultivates that love on the basis of God loving us. Well, that leads me to one more aspect here, a final consideration. And that is, as we engage in these relationships and we develop these feelings, there is always that sense of loss that comes with it. And the loss comes from a number of different ways. The loss comes because people die. The loss comes because friends no longer love the things we love. The loss comes because forces outside of our own take us away from each other. And so what are we to do with that? Well, Augustine, in his sixth confession, says upon reflection of the death of his closest friend, he writes out about the pain that he has experienced, and it is anguishing to read. And what he says is, this is the consequences, this is the punishment that I am receiving for having loved someone other than God. Not, he says, someone more than God, but just someone other than God. And when you love people, what you are doing is engaging in temporary relationships that are bound to result in this sort of pain. So his solution is, stop loving people so much and simply love God. And I think in that particular instance, Augustine is dead wrong. That's not the solution. God doesn't want us to keep our hearts from being broken. He wants us to engage in love that is, as Paul puts it in Ephesians chapter 5, self-sacrificing, heart-sacrificing, heart-breaking. And we will, when we engage in love, put our hearts at risk, and they will be hurt. And it will happen again and again and again. And the more we engage in that with the sort of energy and zeal that God wants us to, really, the harder it hurts. And so that just seems kind of counterintuitive. But I think what we're doing, there are people when a dear one dies, they're comforted by the notion, especially if that person obviously is a Christian. They're comforted by Paul's words, for instance, in 1 Thessalonians 4, we'll see them again, and that is wonderful. But we also know that when you see them again, it won't be the same. Because if my loved one who departed is my beloved wife, and just say, my beloved, right? That is the definition of your spouse should be. My beloved departs, then what? Are you going to get to see her again? I know, but she won't be my beloved anymore. Not the same way. I think a consideration from 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, where we began this morning. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, the one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. So, when I love deeply, and then someone comes along and takes away the object of my deep affection, I am not only comforted by the notion that I could one day see that person again, but in seeing God, I get to see the best of what I had with that person. I don't ever lose that. And even if they are not there, all the value of that relationship will be there. I will recognize God if I have made the love that He exemplifies familiar in my life. He will be familiar in so much as love is familiar to me. So that even if none of the people are there, all of what I gained from those people will be there if I've loved them. Because God is love and He is there. And it will supersede everything I had with those people, even my beloved. So, like a father, God has looked on us with kind and tender affection. And He has called us to see value where He sees value, and so be His friends. He has called us to be His bride and to be one with Him. Loving Him then should be the easiest exercise of all, because He's first loved us. But in the love that He demands from us, He will not have competition. That is where His love is not soft. We must be willing to turn our backs and set down every affection, every friendship, every romance as we approach His throne. Our connections with this world can no longer have the meaning they once had. because something makes shadows of them all, and that is God himself. And so as the world waxes eloquently on thoughts of love, and sometimes hits it right, I hope that you would realize that all of that simply forms a foundation and a basis for understanding that in so much as the world does experience those loves, it is only preaching ultimately something that is more grand that is available. And if you would experience that love, permanent love, the love that will wash out all others, then we would invite you to come and follow the one who has loved you more dearly than any other. Respond to that with obedience. As he said, if you do what I say, you can be my friend. If you would be his friend this evening, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.